Okay, so I'm going to talk about cultural relativism today and using it as a prism for constructing cross-cultural communities. But I want to start by saying that the opinions expressed in this talk are mine. They don't necessarily reflect those that of my employer, the projects I work on, or indeed this conference. In the course of this talk, there may be images or phrases that offend. If there is such offense, it is from lack of knowledge on my part and is unintentional, and let me apologize for any of that now before we start. So, who am I? I'm Claude Warren. I'm a member of the Apache Foundation, been a leader of several cross-cultural teams over the years. I am not the one in Wikipedia, that's my father. And if you look him up, you will find that he was a professor of anthropology, and you will find a link to my mother there as well, and you will find that she was an historian, and they actually met each other at Northwestern University, where they became immersed in the theory and practice of cultural relativism. So I grew up in a framework of cultural relativism. Now, my parents were students of a gentleman by the name of Melville Herskovits, who himself was a student of Franz Boas, who we will get to in a moment. But suffice it to say that my parents were cultural relativists, and okay, yeah, you find me there at all those places. Anyway, so let's talk about culture. What is it? Well, it's learned behavior. This is you learn culture from your family, from your friends, your school, your city, your church, your province, your employer, conferences, anywhere that people gather, you build a culture. And then you get things like culture is not that you eat, but what you eat. And we have here a picture of a durian fruit. I don't know if anybody in this room has tried one. It comes from Southeast Asia. There are signs in the Singapore mass transit terminals that prohibit bringing this fruit into the station or onto the vehicles. It's an acquired taste. I couldn't acquire it. To me, from a Western culture, it smells like rotting flesh. So, but there are people who absolutely love that stuff. I can't tell you why. The other picture, obviously, is a cow. And, a lot of us in this room would look at that and say, oh, yeah, beef or milk and cheese or something like that. But if you're Hindu, that's a sacred animal, and none of those thoughts would occur to you. Okay, so let's look at some other culturally determined perception, perhaps. So it's not that you perceive time, but how you perceive it. So the Aymara people in the Andes perceive time as being in front of them. The history is in front of them for about 7 generations. So if you talk to them, they will talk about 7 generations being in front of them, and then beyond that, it goes from left to right. But the future is behind them. Okay, so they face the past and not the future. And if you were to encourage them to move forward into the future, that would sound absolutely ridiculous. Just as it would say, if we say go forward into the past, it doesn't make any sense to us. Back to the Future, that's a great phrase, wonderful movie. But to the Aymara, that's the way things are. That's their perception of time. Their back is to the future. So now that we have some kind of understanding of culture and some differences, let's look at cultural relativism. So cultural relativism is this idea that your beliefs and practices can only be understood from within the culture that produced them, the culture that surrounds them. Now, this is different from moral relativism, which we're not going to talk about today. But I will say that in anthropology, cultural relativism is a means to get at tools to get outside of your culture, to understand your cultural biases and get outside of that so that you can try to understand other cultures in terms of how they think. When it comes to managing cross-cultural teams, cultural relativism is the prism through which we will detect or discover miscommunication and discuss interactions between members of the team from different cultures. Okay? Now, the first recording of the concept of cultural relativism comes from Herodotus, who was a Greek historian, and he's talking about Darius the Great, who's a Persian ruler. And Darius the Great inquired about funerary customs in the eastern and western fringes of his empire, and as you can see, it was a fairly vast empire for about 500 BCE. And on the eastern edge of that empire, the funerary customs was funerary cannibalism. And on the western edge, it was cremation. And when he told the people in those two separate places about the funerary customs of the other side, those populations were dismayed and abhorred the practices of the other. So this is the first recording of something that we can consider to be a cultural relativistic view of something. Right? That's Herodotus. Now it's Franz Boas, and I told you we'd get to him. There he is. He was professor of anthropology at Columbia University in 1899. And he had many students in anthropology who went on to found other research facilities in anthropology. He is considered the father of American anthropology. He first articulated the idea that civilization is not something that's absolute, but is relative. Now, he didn't coin the phrase, but his work established that idea as axiomatic. But coining the phrase fell to Alan Locke. Alan Locke is the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. He's a philosopher, educator, and he's reviewing Robert Lowy's book. And Robert Lowy is a student of Franz Boas. And in this review, Alan Locke talks about Robert Lowy's extreme cultural relativism. Now, this is something new, sort of somewhat new at the time, because before cultural relativism, you had cultural evolutionism, which was very popular in the Victorian era. So Lowy's arguing that we should be using cultural relativism as opposed to this idea of evolution of culture. So that's the history of the cultural relativism. And then you want to know, why do we care? Well, we care because the tools that are developed by anthropologists and ethnographers are going to allow us to find the friction points between cultures in our cross-cultural teams. And that's important because friction points are going to lead to misunderstandings. And misunderstandings are going to cause cohesive breakdown within the team, where you get members begin to think that other members are working against them or trying to sabotage their efforts. It can cause a misunderstanding in work assignments, which means the wrong thing is getting produced. And it can cause like it says here, cause the wrong thing to be created or be produced. So let's look at a couple of examples of cultural relativism. Okay, so with the exception of people with color vision deficiencies, everybody perceives color in the same way. Light enters your eye, hits the cones and the rods, signals get sent to the brain, boom, color. All right. There are languages that have no word for the color green. Right? So those cultures, you say, go on green, it makes absolutely no sense. They don't have that concept. Instead, they're going to use the color, you tend to use the colors yellow or blue. Okay. In Irish, the name for a person, if you give a person, you call a person by color, it's the color of their hair. So, red somebody or, black, right? But a person of color is called a blue person. Don't know why, but they are. So if you translate the American expression Black Lives Matter and the American expression Blue Lives Matter, you get exactly the same sentence. So a differentiation that is so distinct in American culture and so important in American culture is completely lost if you translate it into Irish. Right? So some other examples. That guy's a bit annoying. Wait a minute. Okay. The thumbs up symbol, right? Yay, everything's good. It's great. In some cultures, that's a rude gesture, so be careful. In ancient Rome, it was, contrary to popular belief, the symbol for put the gladiator to death. In addition, in current usage in online forums, it has begun to have a new meaning. It's transitioning to be one of passive aggressiveness, a passive aggressive way to shut down a conversation. Thumbs up, everything's good, let's get on to the next topic. Now, about 13 years ago, I moved from the US, as you can probably hear, to Ireland, and I discovered that they were two countries separated by a common language. For example, the phrase just about. In Ireland, if you say, I just about caught the bus, it means that I almost missed it, but I managed to get on the bus, and I'm on the bus, I'm going. In the States, if you say, I just about caught the bus, it means I almost got on the bus, but I missed it, and it left without me. So they describe two different outcomes from the same event. Right? And finally, we have the nodding head. And, most of us would say, yeah, nod your head this way, this is yes, and this is no. There are cultures, in fact, I think it's Bulgaria, in Europe, that nodding your head up and down means no, and shaking your head from side to side means yes. And I heard one the other day about one that it's the same motion, and the difference is whether or not the eyes are open or closed. It's the difference between yes and no, okay? So thumbs up gestures, some phrases, idioms will get you in trouble. Things you may not even realize are idioms, and physical gestures like nodding your head are all culturally defined. And we need to be aware of that when we're dealing with cross-cultural teams. Okay, so finally, there are words and phrases, symbols that are unacceptable in certain cultures. In fact, there are symbols that if I were to use them here would be considered a violation of the code of conduct and probably derail this entire conversation. Yet these symbols and phrases are acceptable in other settings and in cultural settings. Now, what cultural relativism teaches us is that when you're in a multicultural setting, if you are confused or triggered by something that is said or done, a symbol, a gesture, a phrase, something like that, you should ask what it means. You don't want to just assume that it's the same as it is in your culture. Right? So, Melville Hershkovitz, my parents' instructor, was a student, as I said, of Franz Boas. He said, judgments are based on experience, and experience is interpreted by each individual in terms of their own enculturation. So you have to be very careful when you're dealing with issues in cross-cultural situations. Okay, so let's look at an example here. Now, I have to state, first off, that I'm obviously from a Western culture, so I have a perception of Western ways of doing things. And the companies that I have worked for have all been Western companies or working in the Western tradition. So these examples come from that, and I am certain there are other ways to do this, and I would be really interested to hear any. But anyway, in this case, we're doing a transition. We're moving the development from one team, one culture to another. In the culture of the receiving team, you can't show failure. It's not allowed. It's a career-limiting move. And the other is that you don't disagree with someone who's perceived to be of a higher status or rank. So the issue here for us trying to do an agile development is that they don't want to do any work in public. They don't want anything to be seen until it's ready for production. right? It's very hard to do code reviews if you're trying to do this. It's very hard to debug problems or assist in problems or even discover that you've got some kind of problem or miscommunication. So what we had to do was we had to figure out how to work around this problem or get around this problem. So what we did was we said that, first of all, what's the problem here? If you have a fear of failure, then you're not going to want to use the source code repository. You're going to avoid talking about issues. You're going to have basically the issues loaded here. If you don't talk about things, then there's an inability to disagree, right? Which means that it leads to development teams avoiding the conflict. So if you stay, development teams wouldn't say that a development date was unreasonable. They would just agree, or they wouldn't agree. They would just say nothing, which was interpreted as agreement. And then if management forgets about a local holiday, the team just thinks, well, that's management just wants us to work through the holiday. There was never a question that this was perhaps an error. So what we did was we made it safe to fail, and we exhibited failures in the original team. And we did that by pointing out, that nobody's going to look at the code in the code base unless you ask them to. So you're not going to look at the jobs that are failing, and you check code and it automatically builds. A failure, nobody's going to look unless you ask them to. If you want help, they're going to go look at it. We showed that developers nobody's allowed to change code on the main branch. Basically, no developer can change code on the main branch. All developers have to follow the same process and exhibited all of that. The other thing, if I go back to the main branch for a minute, we pointed out that if a developer was able to change code on the main branch, then there was a bug in the system that was supposed to make sure they didn't do that, and they should be credited with finding a bug. So, okay, and we also, no code is going to be reviewed or discussed unless it's in the version control system. And this had the benefit of making sure that everything is in the version control system, so when those inevitable desktop, laptop crashes happened, we didn't lose stuff. Okay. We also made it safe to disagree. And this will be good for some of them. We introduced the concept of discussion in our daily stand-ups. Now, I know that this is an anathema for Agile purists, but as our new members came in, they began to see the conversations going on, and they began to open up, and they began to disagree, they began to ask questions, and they began to make much stronger contributions than they would have otherwise. And then we made sure that indelicate questions were not discouraged. And this is, I think, key to most of this, is that if you're in a cross-cultural team, it has to be safe to ask any question. And that question, when asked to you by somebody within your culture, could be extremely rude, but you have to remember where it's coming from, and you can back up and say, in my culture, that's a really rude question to ask. We might ask it this way, or what are you trying to ask? What are you trying to find out? And get the conversation going, but don't just respond with, oh, God, that was terrible. Get out. We're going to file a complaint. Make sure that those questions you're able to ask those questions. Because, in fact, you will end up asking indelicate questions, not realizing that that's what you've done. The end result here is that we built a culture around the project, right? And that project was, that culture said, this is how we do things. And not that your culture is wrong and my culture is right, but this is the culture of the project, and this is how the project does things. So let's all do it this way. Right? So my second example, and this is a good one because it all happens with people from a Western culture, and on Slack, and I asked this question. I said, can I find the schedule of this conference that's coming up? I just need the start and the daily start and end times. Can you tell me what it is, and when the doors open, things like that. And they said, oh, well, yeah, you can go to this website, look it up. And basically I said, I'm not registered, I can't see the schedule. I said, well, if you're not registered, why do you care? And a coworker of mine said, wow, that was really rude. I thought about it, and I said, I've known these guys a long time. The conference is coming up. They're under a lot of stress. They're trying to get through who knows how many things on their schedule in the day. Just get those questions answered, get them out the door, make sure that everybody's got the data they need. So for me, there are people that I've worked with. I know that this is happening, and it would just take too long to say, I don't see why anyone not attending would be interested in start and end times. Can you elaborate on why you want to know? It just, to me, it wasn't rude, but to my coworker, it was. And I think once I explained that this is what was happening, I think that they understood that it really wasn't rude. It was just a shorthand. So let's look at how to succeed. Define the culture of the project in words, not in words, but also in actions. So you can have inclusivity and sensitivity training, and training will tell you what to do, but it's the practice, it's the execution of that training that builds the culture. All right? You should consider cultural differences when you're looking at things like, the discussions that are going on, the planning documents that you're writing, the use case definitions, any of your documentation. You need to consider, are you crossing cultural boundaries, and are there things you have to worry about in terms of misinterpretation? Make it safe to disagree. Make it safe to ask questions. The disagreements can surface cultural differences, and then they can be addressed. And you have to make it safe so that there are no off-limit topics. And finally, make it psychologically safe to fail. Failure can be the result of a misunderstanding that didn't rise to a level of disagreement. So you need to explore both disagreements and failures as the result of possible friction between cultures. And so you need to practice exhibit the culture of the project. So practice what you say you're going to do. Management has to lead by example. If you're saying we're doing everything in the open, you can't have executive washrooms. You can't hide things away. Management failure needs to be done in the public view as well. Now that means, if you have personnel items or other things that are legally encumbered, yeah, absolutely, they need to stay private. But everything else that management is doing really needs to be out here in the public so that the developers can understand where we're going. And there are no hidden conversations. Finally, you want to treat everyone, every objection, every suggestion, and every point of view with respect. You don't have to agree with them, but you do need to treat them with respect. You assume that everyone who is working on the project is working towards success, and never attribute to malice what can be explained by ignorance or cultural differences. So, in closing, when we're connected to others, we become better people. And the art of cross-cultural management resolves to this one point: be a better person. So now, if I've offended anyone with an image, word, or phrase during this talk, please accept my apology and understand that it was unintentional. But also, please let me know so that I can adjust my approach in the future. Thank you.